For centuries, the Arctic has been a frozen world, home to at least 40 indigenous communities living in symbiosis with the ice, the waters, and its animals. But that world is now melting, and that means countries are increasingly competing for influence after decades of cooperation. Why, and what does it mean? Well, on this episode, we explore climate change, people, and power, and how what happens in the Arctic affects all of us. I'm Stefanie Dekker, and welcome to The Stream, where we take digital trends in your online conversations and give them context. Now, before we start, I've just come back from the Arctic Circle myself and filmed this while I was in northern Finland to set up the conversation. Now, you might not believe it, looking at this incredible winter wonderland, and it certainly doesn't feel it. I am wearing all the layers. Why? Because it is minus 35 degrees centigrade. But the Arctic has just recorded its hottest year on record, and it's been a decade of gradual warming, and that is having major implications. Now, you might think that what happens here doesn't affect you. It's so far away, but it does. Scientists have been warning that these rapidly changing Arctic conditions are having a direct impact on rising sea levels, rising sea temperatures, and extreme weather conditions across the planet. Now, the Arctic is warming around 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. So as this incredible icy paradise melts, it is becoming more accessible, and more countries want a piece of it. You've probably heard the US President Donald Trump talk about wanting Greenland, while increasingly we're seeing countries like the US, Russia, Canada, Finland, Norway, Denmark, even China wanting to get involved. Why? There is the belief that there is a vast amount of unexplored wealth of minerals and oil beneath the surface. So is the Arctic the next geopolitical frontier, or will countries work together for a more sustainable future? What happens to the people who have lived here for generations? Well, that was me under the balaclava. If you didn't recognize me, it was absolutely freezing. Well, we're going to dissect Arctic geopolitics a little bit more now, and we're also going to ask whether the voices of indigenous peoples that have been living there for centuries are actually being heard. Well, Donald Trump's obsession with Greenland is a hot topic you are all talking about, but we're going to broaden our discussion out to the Arctic in general. First, we're going to turn to Pavel Devyatkin. He's a senior associate and member of the leadership group at the Quincy Institute. Pavel, let's set up things today, taking a broader look at how you would describe the situation in the Arctic today. What has changed from, let's say, a decade ago?
Thank you for having me, Stefanie. So in general, the Arctic situation is driven by different narratives. You know, you talked about resources, oil and gas, critical minerals, shipping lanes, increasingly being able to be accessed by international shipping companies in different countries, and strategy. The reaction we're seeing, you know, this rush to militarize the region, but it's actually completely out of step with reality. If you look at the numbers, yes, the energy stakes are there. The Arctic holds about 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of natural gas. We see many critical minerals, especially in Greenland and northern Russia. For Russia, the Arctic isn't just a frontier, it's the whole northern border of the country and essential for Russia's economic growth now and in the future. And yes, we're seeing a shift in shipping. You know, this summer alone, we saw dozens of transit voyages carrying cargo between Russia and China. So there's definitely a potential for shipping between Asia and Europe to get shorter. But here's where I want to offer a reality check that sometimes gets left out. Climate change also creates unfavorable conditions for shipping, for energy extraction. You know, global warming leads to increases in precipitation, wind and wave activity, storms, and of course, coastal erosion. So these processes are making it harder to operate in the Arctic, and it's making it more unpredictable and costly. Of course, we're seeing governments are increasing their calls to build infrastructure, to build icebreaker vessels in response to this, but of course, the environment remains a real challenge. And of course, we see the militarization of the region. We saw how President Trump is calling to annex Greenland, not exempting military force or economic coercion.
I just want to pick up on the shipping lanes you were talking about there, because we have a clip we want to play. One of the issues at stake is the potential shipping lanes that are opening up. Let's take a listen.
Here's the biggest island on Earth, Greenland, from a very different perspective. And looking at this, I think helps make more sense of things, more sense of a lot of the things that have been going on recently. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the U.S. as well as our state, Alaska. And then in the top, you can see big ol' Russia. This here is basically the North Pole. So here are all the major players here. And again, you have to consider international trade and sea routes. Right now, if you want to get around the American continents, you either go through the Panama Canal or you go south of Chile and Argentina, which is not only very far for a lot of ships, but it's also pretty treacherous waters. Still a whole lot of shipwrecks that happen down there. But as ice continues to melt, this is going to be a way more feasible place to send your ships through with all the goods. If you're China and you want to ship all your stuff to Europe, then there's a new opportunity to just kind of go straight on through here, which would be way faster. Well, it kind of depends on what part of China. If your goods are being shipped from Hong Kong, then maybe not. This is a pretty big reason why the U.S. really wants Greenland, as well as some other ones, but this is just a factor.
Pavel, you were saying there that, climate change is also a major factor. It is, of course, a very, very difficult and harsh environment, the Arctic, with temperatures and weather patterns you were saying there. But we are seeing geopolitical shifts, aren't we? Is there more of a race now for the Arctic than there was before?
Yeah, we are definitely watching a dangerous escalation in Arctic geopolitics. But I want to emphasize that this isn't inevitable. Right now we're seeing an action-reaction cycle where NATO is having major drills near Russia's border. The NATO alliance has recently expanded to include Finland and Sweden. So now 7 out of the 8 Arctic states are NATO members. Russia is responding to NATO exercises, increasingly cooperating with China in security affairs. Add Trump's threats to annex Greenland, and the whole situation gets messier. But it's really helpful to look at history. We've been here before during the Cold War, and we found a better way out. Even during the darkest days of the Cold War, when the US and USSR were on the brink of nuclear war, the Arctic remained a zone of peace. We were able to separate geopolitics from areas like science diplomacy, from ecosystem protection. There were agreements on polar bear conservation. So the Arctic is, of course, strategically important. But treating the Arctic just as a military theater or a resource colony is definitely a mistake. The path forward isn't just about trying to seize islands like Greenland. It's about returning to building peace through diplomacy and cooperation. And young people especially play an important role in this.
Yeah, because we're going to talk about young people and the rising voices of activism to protect particularly the Indigenous rights who have been living there for generations. But do you think you're talking about the potential for cooperation when you have the language of the US President Donald Trump talking about, taking over Greenland, talking about it as if it's just something that you can buy off a supermarket shelf? Is this helpful? Because it's an incredible statement that he's made.
It's definitely not helpful. Trump is talking about seizing Greenland for national security, but his threats are actually harming national security for the U.S. And this threatens to destroy international law and institutions that have themselves supported U.S. leadership in the world. So in trying to take Greenland, the U.S. is acting like a rogue state and separating itself from the NATO alliance, from the Euro-Atlantic community, and the rest of the world. So, there's no military threat to the U.S. from Greenland. There's no threat of Greenland forming military alliances with Russia or China. Some of the reasoning behind Trump's calls to take Greenland, he says Russia and China are sending ships all along the coasts of Greenland. Nordic diplomats completely reject this claim. They've seen the intelligence. They say there are no ships, there are no submarines near Greenland. Yes, Russia and China are sending ships and bombers and Coast Guard vessels into the Arctic, but they're way out in the Barents and Bering Seas, which are thousands of miles away. So the rhetoric around Greenland is very dangerous for any hope for science diplomacy, for climate adaptation, and for crucial research on the emerging climate catastrophe.
Well, thank you, Pavel. And now, warming up the discussion with 2 Indigenous inhabitants of the Arctic. We're going to turn to Miyuki Daorana, an Indigenous rights and climate activist, and Petra Laiti, a project coordinator for the Saami Council. Now, Miyuki and Petra, before we get into it, I want to get your reaction to this conversation that's been happening on social media.
We need Greenland. from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place.
Miller, the wife of Stephen Miller, a high-ranking Trump official who many people believe is actually kind of running things behind the scenes, posted this on Twitter saying, "Soon," in all caps. And as you can see, it is a photo of Greenland with the American flag on it.
Miyuki, you're from Greenland. How does it make you feel when you listen to the US president talk about your homeland like that?
It makes me feel a lot of emotions, very unsettling ones. At the same time, it's a mix of fear, anxiety, and anger, for sure, of all the injustice that's going on. First, when he was president, at first, he also said the same thing, where me and my friends and my family, we took it a bit more like at ease, laughing it off. And now, this time, it feels very alarming. I know many people have struggles sleeping, and some people are kind of preparing for something if anything happens. There's like, if this happens or that, what are we gonna do? Some people are panicking. A lot of people are angry. A lot of people are tired, and I am tired of hearing the same thing, even though we have said we are not for sale. But Trump seems to just not listen to us at all and just keep repeating, which is very exhausting as well.
Petra, you're listening there. The issue with the Arctic, there's so many different peoples, right, under different governments, I would say. It's been a struggle. It hasn't been easy. Now you've got climate change on top of this. Tell our audience about how important the connection is to the land, your lifestyle, your parents, your grandparents, how you've grown up, and how everything, has it changed? What have you seen change? How would you explain it to people who really don't understand?
Well, thank you for having me here. I think the connection to the land that Indigenous communities still have is quite often misunderstood by Western people and majority people. And essentially, the easiest way I can explain it is it really comes down to very practical knowledge about the area that you inhabit. And what I usually ask people to reflect on is, do you know where your drinking water comes from? Do you know where you could get your nearest firewood if the electricity infrastructure fell? Do you know how to feed yourself off of the land that you live on? And those kinds of very practical sounding things are the basis of indigenous communities and indigenous connection to the land. So you know your land, you know the history of the land, you know how to use the land, and you know how to live on and off your land. And I think it's very important to underline that the climate crisis is going to put the entire world into that question of how are we going to survive off of our land. And the fact that states, Western peoples have forgotten that knowledge for themselves is the root cause of the crisis that we are facing.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? Has the industrialized world forgotten how to use the land, like so many in the Arctic, using how to survive these incredible cold temperatures, how to hunt? Miyuki, what have you seen change in Greenland, so to speak, with your family, your grandparents, the stories they tell? Practically, have you seen a change when it comes to climate change, and what are they?
Yes, of course, because Arctic is experiencing 3 to 4 times faster of the impacts of the climate crisis. Ice is melting vastly, and you can really notice the differences not every year, but even every month, the instability, the dangers of being on sea ice. And I think the issue is also viewing nature and climate and ice as nature disconnected to people, but it's actually we view it as an infrastructure, as transportation routes, as educational grounds, and it has been actual places where my great-grandparents have taught my grandparents how to hunt in specific ice and other landscapes. So they are educational grounds in which we have lost and are still losing. And it's very alarming to see how much it escalates. It's not even on the practical level that way, but also in the language, how we talk about the climate crisis should be nuanced, because from our language, from the Greenlandic Inuit language, we don't even have a word that's for nature, or word for climate, for example, is sila or hila, which means climate, but it also means consciousness. So you can see through our language, we are interconnected to nature in a way that is unavoidable. Even the word for wind or storms is the same word for soul and breath. So in a way that it indicates how much impact we have to nature and how much nature has impact to us. Because it's true, we do get everything from there: food, resources, water. When you shower, you are connected to nature every single day.
So powerful how you talk about how the language is connected to your identity and how it is you live, right? Because we want to take a look at what's happening in the western part of the Arctic. And this is not just happening there, where resource exploitation is back on the agenda, and it's not an isolated case.
There are 5 special areas: the Tashekpek Lake, Colville River, Uticok River Uplands, Kasegaluk Lagoon, and Peard Bay, that are huge, and they're awesome, and they were designated in the Western Arctic because they're so special and they foster so much biodiversity. Drilling could happen right around these areas, or even within them. The Willow Project has 1 drilling pad sited within the Tashekpek Lake Special Area. And that's terrible for ecosystems, it's terrible for subsistence for Alaska Native peoples, and you should join me and all the incredible organizations fighting to stop Arctic drilling by submitting your comment today with the Bureau of Land Management.
Petra, we're just talking to Miyuki about how closely connected to the land so many Indigenous peoples are. I know the Saami, of course, the same. So much has changed also with your communities. We're looking at different countries wanting to explore what's underneath the Arctic as the ice melts. Do you think that this is something that can be stopped, or do you fear for the future?
I think the biggest challenge is the misconception that many Western states, as we see with the question of U.S. annexation of Greenland, is a perfect symptom of this misconception that just because resources are or have been previously inaccessible, that means that they are up for claim. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if the Arctic ice sheets in Greenland melt and minerals are exposed, those minerals still rightfully belong to the Greenlandic people and the indigenous people of that area. Same with the other Arctic places as well. The minerals, the woods, the animals, the natural resources that exist on indigenous land rightfully belong to the indigenous people who govern that land and that area. And those are not up for claim. But this misconception that they are is the driving factor for the Arctic race for resources. And as Pavel said in his previous presentation, or with your discussion, the world in which many of those resources would be accessible is a terrifying sight because of weather conditions, because of uninhabitable areas. And I'm very scared of the fact that states are unable to reflect what it would mean for the global climate and for an inhabitable Earth if those resources did indeed become accessible. So it's not just a question of indigenous ownership being ignored and stepped on, but also, quite frankly, the fate of humanity is hanging by the question of those resources remaining inaccessible.
Absolutely. Many researchers will tell you that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It affects us all. It has global implications. Miyuki, Petra was talking there about Indigenous rights. Do you feel that your community has its rights respected, your voices are being heard? I mean, there's been a lot of struggles, hasn't there, with these communities and governments. And a lot of your communities have been there before borders were drawn out of these modern states that are now vying for pieces of the Arctic, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed. We've been affected and in contact with different kinds of explorers, even before the official colonization of the North, because I am from the very north town of Greenland called Qaanaaq, next to the Thule Air Base. They have the American Air Base.
That's the U.S. Air Base, yes, correct, okay.
Yes, and in terms of Indigenous rights, if they're being respected in Greenland, is a very good question, and I'm happy that you asked this because it's a very great issue. There's a huge issue with ignorance within our country, but also in Denmark. I used to live in Denmark as well, where even the word Indigenous rights is not even well known or used at all. I've followed a lot of different political debates and talks from the Danish side and the Greenlandic side, and there's no mention of UNDRIP or ILO Convention. And I had no idea that Denmark had ratified the ILO Convention number 169 in 1989. No one knows, at least from school. When I grew up in Greenland, we haven't had anything about that. Even when we were having classes about history, I also used to work at the government of Greenland under the Department of Climate. And I asked around, talked to the Parliament of Greenland as well. They did not know anything about United Nations declarations of the rights of Indigenous peoples. They also did not know anything, the difference between that and ILO Convention, because soft law exists, yes, and then we have the hard law that creates consequences if it's being violated, in which Denmark has signed for, but they do not implement it in mineral strategies that they made in 2022 and 2023.
There's always, sorry to jump in there, Miyuki, but there's always an issue, isn't there, with laws and consequences being applied, even if there is an umbrella of protection. Petra, I want to give the final word to you. What do you want? You talk a lot about the misinterpretation, the ignorance among those people who do not know your communities, do not know your regions. What do you want people to understand, to know about the Arctic, to know about its people, its the animals? What do you want to convey to those who just talk about the Arctic as yet another potential frontier?
Is that the Arctic is already spoken for. It's already the home of our people, of the family of Arctic Indigenous peoples. And the Arctic Indigenous peoples do have the right to both self-determine our present and our future, but we also do in fact have the right to our own land, our own resources, and any potential resources that the climate crisis might unveil. How the Arctic deals with the climate crisis is up to the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, and Indigenous people should both own and lead the processes on how the Arctic is changing and how we are going to manage that crisis. And not a thing Stephen Miller or Donald Trump is saying is going to change that right for the Arctic Indigenous peoples.
Miyuki, the same question to you. What do you want people to know about the importance of the land, the importance to your community of what the land is and why it should stay exactly as it is?
That we should terminate the socio-Darwinistic thinking in a way that there is a traditional way of life and modern, and there's some kind of idea of underdeveloped and more developed people, because that is a destructive way of thinking that ultimately destroys nature and causes climate crisis. And maybe talk about climate change as a climate crime, shift the focus from nature to man, because who is doing these pollutions and who is causing pollution, who is causing the damages done to nature. We need to shift the focus to that.
I think that's a very important point to end on. The message is the same from both of you, to respect and understand the Indigenous rights of the people who have lived there for generations. Miyuki and Petra, thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for watching. From me and the entire Stream team, I will see you soon.